人口持续下降的话，会是对整个社会都会产生影响的，对我们包括我们对自己的生活各方面都会有。
China's birth rate has been falling. To slow down the fall, the Chinese government adopted a two-child policy in 2016. Couples are allowed to have a second child, but it wasn't enough. 10 million babies were born in 2021, down from the 12 million recorded in 2020 and 14 million in 2019. 2021 saw the slowest population growth in nearly 60 years. It grew by only 480,000 people. Meanwhile, the over 60 population increased by more than 3 million from 2020 to 2021. And in 2021, the three-child policy was enacted. An aging population presents legitimate concerns for our economy and society. As a result, the nation is calling for more newborns. But people aren't just numbers on paper. For the general public, every adult has his or her own priorities when it comes to life choices. Having kids is a choice and a very personal one. In between lies, for the lack of a better word, the conflict.
就我来说，我觉得现在生一个孩子就是怎么说，就经济方面，我觉得压力比较大，因为现在都讲优生优育，就是肯定会在各个方面，比如经济方面呀，这个投入人力物力方面呀，都会投入了很多。所以，我觉得很多年轻人不生孩子，可能我觉得主要这方面的原因占比较大的一方面的因素，就是经济。
我也是觉着现在压力挺大的，就是生活压力啊、工作压力啊等等各方面吧，包括家庭。
但我个人的话，我觉得在成长的过程当中，我父母对我最大的这个资金的投入就是在教育方面，所以我觉得如果说每一个孩子都用同样的资金去投入的话，其实对于一个家庭来说，就是父母其实是有非常大的负担和压力的。
Pressure, 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 and expensive. That's what you hear. When people talk about having children in China these days, they usually ask two questions. First, do we want to have children? Second, can we afford to have one? The rising standard of life created by China's economic development is making the idea of raising children more daunting. As you can see from the people we talk to, if you want to do it right, it means more time, energy, and money invested. But then the lack of kids could make sustaining that standard difficult. The fear is that without enough population growth, we wouldn't be able to maintain the economic growth we've enjoyed for the last decades.
We will see a gradual shrinkage of so-called young labor force if we define that from roughly about 20 to 30 years old. That's a fact because that generation has been born and we will see a gradual decline. At the same time, the old generation will grow.
And according to Yang Jingrui, the deputy director of China's National Health Commission's Population Surveillance and Family Development Department, the window for reaping demographic dividend is about to close. The question is, what should the government do?
我觉得就是说，在就是比如说住房价的这些管控啊，还有就是年轻人这收入方面。我觉得都要提高，你不提高这个经济的话，就怎么去，就很现实的问题。我觉得，
其实还是配套措施的加强吧。比如说，现在国家有一个很好的政策叫个税专项扣除，我觉得比如可以再增添更多的项目，然后以缓解就是每个家庭现在面临比如说孩子的养育问题的经济压力，然后吃穿用度方面的经济压力。教育方面的经济压力等等。
其实我觉得是一个平权，男女平权的问题。就是其实我一直觉得应该给男性休产假，我觉得让男性也休的话，其实是一个双方吧，双方的话都可以得到一个就是比较好的平衡。这样的话，女性可能也就会比较愿意再要更多的孩子吧，可能是这样。我觉得
我可能又跟工作联系在一起了，因为对于这个女的员工就业，然后求职的问题，如果能给到更多的这个保障性的东西，他们可能会觉得更有安全感。因为现在这个职场竞争挺厉害的，特别是说如果生2胎或者3胎回来之后，他的工作可能会受到一些影响。我觉得在 这个就是劳动保障，或者说在雇主跟员工之间的这方面，可能有需要加强的地方。
The Chinese government is trying to push the birth rate up, and they are pushing through a whole series of policies on maternity leave or child support. How do you assess Chinese government's performance on this issue so far, and what more do you expect the government should do in this regard?
I mean, what's interesting in China at this point is in terms of your total fertility rate, so in terms of how many children per average per woman, we're looking at 1.3. But if you ask a different question, which is how many children would you like to have, so aspirational fertility, then actually that number comes out as 1.8. So with that gap, what we need to be thinking about is in terms of the new policies and investments that the government's making, are they adequate to really shift from that 1.3, the reality now, to that 1.8 in terms of enabling couples to really fulfill their fertility desires? It's important to have a package of different investments rather than just focusing on one particular element of support. But we also have to be realistic. So when we look at countries that have looked at their current low fertility and they've come up with a range of policies and packages to try and support couples to have more children, the trend we tend to see is, I mean, if you think that fertility rates are going down, so when these policies come in place, you will see a sudden bump or increase in fertility, but that won't get sustained. That doesn't keep going up, 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 up. You get this bump and then it tends to even out at a higher rate. So we aren't seeing any countries that have managed to introduce policies or interventions that take us right back to, you know, the old days of replacement fertility at 2.1, I mean even 2.4, you know, maybe going back to the 70s and early 80s in some developed economies. So we do need to be realistic about this.
Being realistic means we have to ask a very realistic question. Is this going to hurt the economy? If it's hard to get back to the previous birth rate, we may have to work with the one we could achieve. I asked Dr. Coulson the question. What she told me is that we may have to think about this in a different way. She said that by 2050, 50% of Chinese population will still be productive labor force. It's still a very large pool of people, but the way of working might be changing considerably. So the size of the new labor force might not necessarily be as important as the quality of it.
I mean, 1970, you would see a plant full of working men, mainly men, building cars in this very labor-intensive way. I mean, today you walk into a car production plant and we see robots doing most of the work. So in the same way, when we look forward to the way we're going to start using new technologies, be it artificial intelligence, a much broader use of robotics, it's likely to be that many labour-intensive jobs and roles we see today will be completely transformed over the next 20 to 30 years, and therefore having a large labour force may not be as important as having a well-educated, productive labour force.
What we see through these conversations we've had is that the conflict is rather a pool of different interests. Each individual has his or her own demand and each requires an individual solution. And while the nation is calling out to have more children and doing all they can to facilitate that, the policies have to be humanized. There needs to be more high-quality supportive policies and mechanisms to help the people choose.